Before you take another step forward, I want you to freeze. Pay attention to what your hands are doing right now. Look at your shoulders. Are they slightly raised toward your ears? Is your breathing shallow, confined entirely to your upper chest? Most people listening to this are carrying a subconscious baseline of tension, a micro state of vigilance, and they don't even realize it. Here is a brutal reality about human psychology. Most of what you call your personality is actually a collection of survival adaptations you adopted before you turned 12 years old. When you were young, you learned that being agreeable, highly tolerant, and overly patient kept you safe. You conditioned yourself to absorb other people's chaotic energy, to excuse poor behavior, and to internalize disrespect as something you just had to manage. You labeled it as being understanding. You told yourself you were patient. But let's call it what it actually was: subconscious compliance. Today we are dissecting a psychological law that completely flips this operational dynamic on its head. The more you heal, the less you tolerate. If you stick with me through this entire presentation, I am going to give you a complete diagnostic framework to audit your life. I am going to show you exact behavioral markers that reveal whether you are operating from a place of genuine psychological strength or if you are still running outdated compliance scripts. By the end of this speech, you will understand precisely why the people who used to walk all over you are suddenly claiming that you've changed, and you'll learn the exact psychological mechanisms required to keep your personal boundaries absolute, effortless, and unshakable. If you leave right now, you will continue mistaking your high tolerance for toxicity as a virtue. But if you stay, you will learn how to rewrite your internal behavioral code once and for all. Pay close attention to what follows. Look around you. In any given room, 90% of the people walking past you are running pre-programmed behavioral scripts designed to seek approval and avoid conflict at all costs. They accept late replies, subtle disrespect, passive-aggressive comments, and boundary violations, not because they are nice, but because their subconscious brain registers conflict as a threat to survival. They think they are being forgiving. In reality, they are operating under low-authority baseline programming. If you want to understand human behavior at the highest level, you have to understand this core rule. Tolerance is a direct metric of your internal baseline. When your internal baseline is broken, when you carry unhealed trauma, unresolved guilt, or an underlying fear of abandonment, your system learns to tolerate high levels of external chaos. You accept poor treatment because, subconsciously, it matches the unstable internal environment you've normalized. Why should you listen to every single word of this breakdown today? Because if you do not understand the mechanics of how healing alters your tolerance thresholds, you will continue to allow toxic, low-value individuals to hijack your time, your focus, and your physiological state. Stay tuned for the next few minutes because we are going to dismantle the exact psychological trap keeping you obedient to people who don't deserve access to your life. Let's dismantle a common myth. Many people wear their high tolerance like a badge of honor. I am so patient. I give people 10 chances. From a behavioral intelligence perspective, high tolerance for poor behavior isn't patience. It's a lack of authority. When you have a high tolerance for disrespect, your brain is sending a clear signal. I need this person's validation more than I respect my own boundary. When an individual operates from unhealed baseline scripts, their central nervous system is perpetually searching for external stability. They will compromise their standards just to keep the peace. They will ignore red flags, micro-expressions of contempt, subtle boundary tests, conversational dominance tactics, because calling them out creates tension, and tension feels dangerous to an unhealed mind. Healing isn't a warm, soft, emotional process. Healing is an upgrading of your cognitive software. When you begin to heal, your internal authority rises. You stop relying on external validation to regulate your nervous system. Your posture changes, your speech cadence slows down, and your subconscious stops treating other people's opinions as survival mandates. When this structural shift occurs, your tolerance threshold instantly drops, not out of anger, but out of pure efficiency. Think of it like an elite operating system. A clean, high-performance system immediately detects malware. It doesn't negotiate with the malware. It doesn't try to reason with it or give it a second chance. It quarantines and removes it. When you heal, manipulation becomes audible. You start hearing the covert scripts behind people's words. Disrespect creates immediate friction. What you used to brush off now feels like a loud, dissonant alarm in your nervous system. Action becomes effortless. You no longer over-explain your boundaries. You state them once, or simply remove your presence. Notice how weak boundaries sound versus strong boundaries. Someone operating on low internal authority says, "I really wish you wouldn't talk to me like that. It makes me feel uncomfortable, and I've told you 3 times already." That is a plea for permission. Someone who is healed and operates on high authority says, "That tone doesn't work for me." And if it continues, they disengage completely. No drama, no emotional explosion, just silent, definitive execution. When you heal, you stop trying to control or change other people's behavior. Instead, you change their level of access to you. The people who got used to your old compliance scripts will not like your new boundaries. They will call you cold, intolerant, or stubborn. Recognize that feedback for what it truly is, a sign that the system is working. When you raise your baseline, you filter out low-value interactions automatically. The goal of healing is not to become tolerant of everything. The goal of healing is to become so deeply grounded in your own internal authority that anything toxic, dishonest, or manipulative simply cannot exist in your proximity. The more you heal, the less you tolerate. Not because you've become bitter, but because you've finally recognized the value of your own sovereignty. Stand tall, protect your focus, and stop apologizing for refusing to accommodate chaos. The core transformation of true psychological healing is not a soothing emotional comfort, but a fundamental rewrite of your internal baseline scripts, a complete migration from a survival mode of subconscious compliance to an operational mode of absolute self-governance. Most individuals spend their entire lives operating under ancient software installed during early childhood development. When a child learns that parental approval, safety, or emotional peace requires them to suppress their own voice, alter their demeanor, or absorb adult distress, their central nervous system writes a hard-coded rule: compliance equals survival. This rule becomes an automatic script running silently in the background of their adult life, dictating every relationship, professional interaction, and personal boundary. When you remain trapped in these unhealed baseline scripts, your default operational state is threat avoidance. You mistake being overly accommodating, agreeable, and tolerant for virtues such as kindness, patience, or empathy. In reality, your nervous system is simply running a high-frequency scan of your environment, constantly scanning micro-expressions, shifts in vocal tone, and spatial positioning to anticipate potential conflict or rejection. You alter your words before speaking them. You soften your tone to prevent discomfort in others. And you allow small boundary violations to pass unchecked because your subconscious mind evaluates confrontation as a direct threat to your safety. You are living in a state of self-imposed obedience, allowing external forces to govern your internal reality. Healing, in its truest behavioral sense, is the process of exposing and rewriting these outdated scripts. It requires you to step back and systematically audit the automatic programs running your behavior. As you trace these patterns back to their origin, you begin to dismantle the irrational belief that conflict is fatal or that other people's emotional states are your responsibility. This cognitive shift systematically recalibrates your nervous system. You transition from a state of hypervigilant compliance to a state of calm, grounded authority. When you execute this baseline transition, your relationship with control changes permanently. Under the old survival script, you attempted to control the environment around you by pleasing everyone and avoiding friction at all costs. Under the new operational script of self-governance, you abandon the desire to manage or manipulate external perceptions. You accept that you cannot control how others act, speak, or react, but you retain absolute, uncompromising control over your own presence, your own time, and your own standards. This shift to operational self-governance completely alters your physiological and psychological posture. Your speech cadence becomes deliberate, unhurried, and precise, free from the nervous impulse to fill silences or explain your existence. Your physical baseline stabilizes, your shoulders drop, your breathing deepens into the lower abdominal cavity, and your micro-movements reflect an unshakable internal equilibrium. You no longer seek permission to exist, to set a boundary, or to walk away from low-value situations. You realize that your sovereignty is non-negotiable. By replacing subconscious compliance with conscious self-governance, you stop surviving your life and begin directing it with total authority. High tolerance for disrespect, manipulation, or toxicity is almost universally mislabeled as a noble character trait, rebranded as patience, grace, or exceptional kindness. In reality, from a behavioral intelligence perspective, an abnormally high tolerance threshold is rarely a sign of virtue. It is a subconscious compliance mechanism rooted deeply in a perceived lack of self-worth and an underlying fear of abandonment. When an individual operates with an unhealed baseline, their internal software misinterprets self-sacrifice as a necessary trade-off for relational safety. They convince themselves that by enduring mistreatment, swallowing valid grievances, and continuously forgiving habitual boundary breaches, they are demonstrating loyalty or strength. In truth, they are executing a protective survival routine designed to keep the peace at the expense of their own psychological integrity. This behavioral pattern is often built on an invisible internal exchange rate. The individual subconsciously calculates that maintaining a connection, even a harmful, asymmetrical, or manipulative one, is safer than facing the friction of confrontation or the vacuum of isolation. As a result, when another person engages in subtle disrespect, covert manipulation, or overt boundary tests, the compliance mechanism immediately activates. Rather than registering the offense as an intolerable breach that requires immediate corrective action or disengagement, the mind rationalizes the behavior. It manufactures excuses for the offender, blaming their stress, their past trauma, or simple misunderstanding, effectively absorbing the impact of the disrespect so the relationship can continue undisturbed. This dynamic creates what can be termed high-tolerance masking. The person hides their legitimate anger, frustration, and boundary violations behind a facade of endless understanding and flexibility. They wear their ability to absorb chaos like armor, taking pride in being the person who never breaks, the one who can endure any emotional weather. But this mask comes at an immense physiological and psychological cost. Because the disrespect is internalized rather than confronted or filtered out, the body retains the tension. Shallow breathing, chronic physical strain, suppressed resentment, and mental fatigue are the inevitable biological tax paid for maintaining a high tolerance for low-value behavior. When you look closely at the behavioral mechanics, high tolerance functions as an open invitation for further exploitation. Predators, covert manipulators, and chronically selfish individuals are highly skilled at running subtle boundary tests, microdoses of disrespect designed to gauge a person's baseline resistance. When those tests meet an endless reservoir of tolerance and rationalization, the manipulator receives a clear green light to escalate. The passive recipient becomes trapped in a compounding loop where their reluctance to enforce a firm boundary continuously lowers their perceived value in the eyes of the transgressor, leading to increasingly severe breaches over time. To break this compliance loop, one must dismantle the false narrative that high tolerance equals goodness. Recognizing that your willingness to tolerate mistreatment stems from a subconscious fear of conflict or rejection is the first step toward reclaiming agency. True self-worth does not negotiate with disrespect, nor does it mistake silent endurance for dignity. When an individual recognizes that their boundaries are not suggestions, but absolute operational parameters, the need for high tolerance masking completely evaporates, leaving behind a crisp, unshakable standard of self-respect. As your psychological baseline stabilizes through genuine healing, your brain undergoes a radical shift in how it processes human behavior and environmental feedback. In an unhealed state, your nervous system is accustomed to high levels of background noise, emotional volatility, subtle disrespect, covert manipulation, and unpredictable boundary shifts. Because this chaos matches your historical baseline, your brain normalizes it, treating toxic dynamics as standard operational conditions. However, when you do the internal work to recalibrate your nervous system, your baseline shifts to a steady state of calm, clarity, and internal authority. In this elevated baseline, low-value behaviors and manipulation tactics no longer blend into the background. They instantly register as high-frequency friction, triggering an automatic threat assessment and demanding immediate boundary enforcement. Behavioral friction occurs whenever someone's conduct clashes with your established standard of self-governance. When your psychological baseline is ungrounded, you expend vast amounts of mental energy rationalizing that friction away, convincing yourself that a microaggression was just a joke, or that someone's passive-aggressive tone was merely a bad mood. But once your internal environment is clear, your brain processes social input with clinical precision. A subtle conversational dominance play, an attempt to induce guilt, a broken promise, or a passive-aggressive remark stands out immediately like a glaring error in a clean line of code. You no longer have to analyze whether something feels wrong. Your body and mind register the dissonance instantly because your baseline no longer tolerates uncalibrated noise. This sensory and cognitive clarity fundamentally changes your threat assessment protocols. Under outdated survival scripts, a threat was defined as anything that risked losing another person's approval or causing interpersonal conflict. In a healed state, the definition of a threat flips completely. The only real threat to your sovereignty is allowing toxic, chaotic, or manipulative friction to remain unchecked in your space. Your central nervous system stops prioritizing the comfort of the transgressor and begins prioritizing the preservation of your internal peace. The moment behavioral friction is detected, your brain no longer defaults to emotional panic, self-doubt, or defensive arguing. Instead, it moves straight to cold, calculated evaluation and execution. When low-value behavior is recognized as friction, boundary enforcement ceases to be a dramatic, highly emotional event and becomes a neutral, operational necessity. You stop viewing a boundary as an attack on the other person or a desperate attempt to force them to change. You view boundary enforcement simply as the restoration of equilibrium. If an individual brings manipulation or disrespect into your environment, you do not debate them, lecture them, or enter into an emotional spiral. You identify the friction, recognize the underlying behavioral play, and apply the appropriate structural response, whether that means issuing a direct, unshakable verbal boundary or disengaging your attention and removing your presence altogether. By converting your reaction to disrespect from an emotional crisis into a clear-eyed threat assessment, you reclaim total control of your energy and focus. You understand that your attention is a high-value resource, and anything that introduces unnecessary friction is an inefficient drain on your system. As this operational clarity takes over, people who rely on subtle manipulation or casual disrespect find it impossible to anchor themselves in your life, because every attempt they make to test your boundaries is met with immediate, effortless, and uncompromising correction. The friction versus flow diagnostic serves as an unshakable real-time metric for measuring the precise extent of your psychological healing and internal authority. Human behavior is ultimately driven by subconscious scripts, and those scripts express themselves most clearly in how quickly you respond to environmental disruptions. When you operate from an ungrounded or unhealed baseline, your internal threshold for friction is catastrophically high. Disrespect, passive-aggressive communication, boundary breaches, and manipulative guilt trips can exist in your immediate environment for weeks, months, or even years before you take corrective action. During that entire duration, you rationalization the delay, telling yourself that you are gathering more evidence, waiting for the right moment, or attempting to preserve the peace, when in reality, your system is frozen in a state of subconscious compliance and conflict avoidance. By measuring the time delay between the moment disrespect occurs and the moment you execute a boundary, you obtain a clear diagnostic reading of your internal sovereignty. In a low-authority state, the diagnostic gap is massive. A boundary breach happens, and instead of taking immediate operational control, your mind loops through self-doubt, hypervigilance, and emotional rumination. You spend hours analyzing the other person's intentions, drafting hypothetical arguments in your head, or convincing yourself that speaking up will cause catastrophic fallout. This prolonged delay allows toxic friction to linger, steadily draining your physical and mental bandwidth while communicating to the transgressor that their low-value behavior carries no real operational cost. As you heal and your baseline recalibrates, this diagnostic gap rapidly shrinks from years to months, from days to minutes, and ultimately to real-time disengagement. When your internal authority is absolute, friction is met with immediate proportional resistance or removal. You no longer allow disrespect to sit in your environment and ferment into resentment. The moment an individual attempts a boundary test or conversational manipulation tactic, your system registers the dissonance instantly, and you execute a response without hesitation. This execution does not require raised voices, emotional outbursts, or defensive explanations. It is characterized by cold, calm, and decisive action that restores equilibrium instantly. Applying the friction versus flow diagnostic requires an ongoing, honest audit of your daily interactions across all domains of life. You examine how long you allow a client to underpay or overstep project parameters, how long you permit a friend to make backhanded remarks, or how many times you tolerate a family member crossing a clear verbal boundary before you adjust their access to you. When you notice a lag between the occurrence of friction and your corrective response, you identify the exact location where an outdated compliance script is still active. Healing is not proven by how deeply you understand psychological concepts. It is proven by how rapidly you eliminate friction to maintain your internal flow. Ultimately, living in a state of flow is the natural outcome of minimizing the lifespan of toxic friction in your life. Flow is not an effortless accident, but a structured environment created and protected by zero-tolerance boundary execution. When you systematically shrink your response time to disrespect, low-value individuals naturally self-select out of your sphere because they can no longer find a foothold to exploit. Your space remains clean, calm, and highly focused, allowing your energy to be directed entirely toward high-value endeavors, deep personal growth, and authentic relationships anchored in mutual respect. The concept of the authority baseline represents the ultimate psychological shift in personal sovereignty, where emotional healing naturally elevates your internal baseline to a frequency that renders you completely immune to guilt trips, covert manipulation, and subconscious compliance tactics. In an unhealed state, an individual operates with a low or unstable authority baseline, making their psychological perimeter incredibly porous. Toxic individuals and chronic manipulators thrive in this low baseline environment because they can easily weaponize obligation, shame, and fear to control the person's behavior. When your self-worth is tied to external approval, anyone who threatens to withhold that approval gains immediate, unearned leverage over your emotional state, forcing you into defensive positioning and compliance. As you heal, your internal authority baseline rises, altering the very physics of your social interactions. Emotional healing is not merely about managing stress. It is the process of anchoring your identity entirely within yourself, independent of external validation or criticism. When your authority baseline is firmly established, your central nervous system stops seeking permission from others to hold a boundary, express an opinion, or walk away from a toxic situation. This structural shift dismantles the psychological anchors that manipulators rely on. When someone attempts to use guilt as a leverage point, framing your boundary as selfishness or your independence as disloyalty, the tactic fails completely because your baseline no longer contains the unhealed residue of shame required for the guilt trip to take root. From a behavioral intelligence perspective, high internal authority creates an unshakable psychological armor through complete emotional neutralization. Manipulative tactics require a reactive charge to be successful. They rely on you becoming defensive, flustered, or overly explanatory. When your authority baseline is high, an attempt to manipulate you is met with absolute stillness and clinical detachment. You see the conversational play for what it is, a desperate attempt to lower your status and gain compliance, and you refuse to engage with the drama. Because you do not offer emotional resistance, the manipulator's push meets no leverage, causing their effort to collapse under its own weight, while your boundary remains completely intact. This elevation of your authority baseline fundamentally transforms how you project presence in every room you enter. Your nonverbal baseline signals a total absence of submissive posture. Your vocal tone becomes steady, unhurried, and free from rising inflections that seek validation. Your eye contact becomes calm and direct, and your physical movements lack the jerky, nervous energy of someone trying to manage the comfort of those around them. This physical and psychological posture broadcasts a clear, subconscious signal to everyone in your environment that compliance tactics will not work on you. High-value individuals register this presence as authentic strength, while toxic individuals quickly recognize that attempting to manipulate you will yield zero return on their investment. Ultimately, achieving a high authority baseline means that your boundaries no longer require constant vigilance, aggressive fighting, or exhausting emotional energy to maintain. Boundaries cease to be rules you have to constantly defend, and instead become an effortless extension of who you are. You no longer waste time persuading manipulators to treat you with respect or explaining the validity of your standards. By standing securely in your internal authority, you establish an environment where disrespect cannot survive, ensuring that your time, focus, and emotional bandwidth are strictly reserved for spaces and relationships that match your elevated baseline.